Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. Today, Jim and I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Christina Dent. Christina is a politically conservative Christian who supported criminalizing drugs until she became a foster parent and saw the negative effects up close. She researched why drug-related harm isn't decreasing and became convinced it's because the criminal justice system is the wrong tool for addressing drug use. Today, we want to explore how Christina's faith-based response to her adverse childhood experiences influences everything she does today. By the way, this episode of Gracearchy is sponsored by the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity, which is doing awesome work to advance the principle of human respect in the world. And by the way, if you or your organization would like to join the sponsorship of Gracearchy, please reach out to us. Now, welcome, Christina.
Let me just put a special point on the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity. I work with them. It's one of my many hats that I wear. And this principle of human respect will come up during the course of this discussion, but I'm grateful for them. They're at harmonyandprosperity.org. Hi, Christina.
Hey, so good to be with you.
Yes. And so your organization is End It for Good, and we are here. We're going to discuss your book, Curious, today. I've read most of it twice now, and I've had a chance to watch, and everybody should watch, Bill, Christina's TED Talk when she was first starting out, as I'm understanding it, right? I mean, this kind of early days for you.
Yes. I did the TED Talk about 5 years ago, which was the beginning of End It for Good. We became a 501c3 nonprofit that year also. And the basis of the talk that I give hasn't changed much, because what I found is that I am not unique in the world in that I didn't understand what was happening, why we weren't getting better results related to drugs and addiction. And so I am always wanting to talk with new people, new audiences. How many people can we get in front of to help them rethink these core problems that are plaguing us and that are why we're not getting better results related to drugs and addiction. So the temptation is always to kind of move on, the sort of curse of knowledge where you learn something and then you go deeper and deeper and you aren't able to even talk to people anymore who are outside of your kind of deep in the weeds with you. And we've worked really hard to stay on this trajectory of reaching more people, helping people rethink this, because people can't change their minds and our policy won't change if they don't understand what's actually happening first. And so we feel like that's one of the things that we can bring to the world is helping more people understand.
Fantastic. All right. So our show, Gracearchy, for me, my faith and my belief in freedom, they're warp and woof. They go together. There's no separation between those two things for me at all. I don't have any problem being 100% what I am in the political realm versus what I am spiritually. There's just no distinction between those two things. I don't want to talk too much about where I'm coming from today. I want to, obviously, because not only because you're the guest, but because I hope that the people that you're looking to reach, to the degree that maybe we're reaching some of those same people in this show, or have the potential for people that already follow my show, where they know somebody who comes from where we come from. And in that case, for both of us, it's an evangelical Christian background. Is that correct?
Yep.
I would like those people to be able to be touched by what's here today. So there are policy agreements that we have that are very strong, that I want to focus on. But on the theological basis, I really want it to be your message today that would come through in all of this. And I want to start off by emphasizing something. You describe yourself, you're involved in basically ending drug prohibition, but you don't smoke, you don't drink, you don't chew, you don't hang out with people who do too much, right? I'm curious because you describe all this in the book. Have you ever smoked cigarettes yet? Has that day come?
No, it has not come. It's never coming, Jim. It's just never coming. No cigarettes, no, marijuana. I've traveled to many states where it's legal now. I have zero interest in trying it. I don't enjoy the taste of alcohol, so I don't drink. My interest in this issue is a human interest. This is a human, thriving, human life issue for me, which is why I care so much about it.
Okay, so just unpack that just a tiny bit, because I hear life, and that is almost a buzzword in the evangelical world. But what does life mean to you? Yeah,
so I grew up in a very conservative Christian community, culture. I'm a born and raised Mississippian. I've lived here my whole life. And so I grew up under a very strong pro-life ethic. I was part of, doing a walk for life, a march for this and that here in the state. And it was not things that my parents made me do. Oftentimes they didn't participate at all. I went with a friend that I wanted to go with. I felt like it was important. I wanted to be part of that. So in my younger years, my thinking about the value of life, I wouldn't have said it was only really focused on babies, but I think looking back on that, I think that very much was what it was. And I was able to not see my own blind spots of where that ethic of valuing human life was not being carried through to other groups of people. So I thought of myself as a very compassionate person, but I was blind to the fact that I was compassionate sometimes. And then I could be very judgmental other times. My husband still tells me I have the gift of judgment. It's one of my spiritual gifts. So apparently I'm still struggling some. I still got something to grow in here.
Well, let's talk about where you come from a little bit more, about your family, because it's a big part of the opening of the book, Curious by Christina Dent, which I highly recommend. We will have a link to that in the show notes as well. I got to meet your brother at Freedom Fest. We both got to meet for the very first time face to face, but I got to meet your brother as well. And I watched both of you speak. Your style is quite different. You guys are very different people, even though you're the same household, right? Personalities are a little bit distinct. But the thing that I find interesting here, how many siblings do you have total? How many are in the family?
3 older brothers, very close in age. So my oldest brother is only 5 years older than me. So it's basically like a child every 18 months. There's 4 of us total. I was the baby and the only girl.
Okay. So, but I imagine it means they also all look out for you a bit too.
Not growing up. Growing up, it was like tease fest, and here's the person who's easiest to make fun of. But we have a great relationship now.
All right. But, and you bring him up in the acknowledgments as well, this same brother. How is it that you became socially active? How did he become? Like, I'm interested kind of like, this is about your family. Like, this is something you don't really get into in the book. I want to know, like, is that an accident that the two of you are both kind of working in activist areas?
That's an interesting question. So the family I grew up in was very non-traditional. So we started homeschooling in the early 80s when the homeschooling movement was just at its very beginning stages. I think when we started homeschooling, there were 80 families in the whole state that were homeschooling. Now there's thousands. So my parents very much kind of walked to the beat of their own drummer. We lived in a very small house, less than 800 square feet, 2-bedroom, 1 bath with, 6 people in the home. My dad had 2 master's degrees, but they chose this really simple life. They felt like that was what God was calling them to. That's what they felt like was what he wanted for that season. And it ended up being, my whole childhood. We never moved out of that house. And so I grew up with a family ethic of, we don't just do things because everyone else does them. Like, that was never getting you anywhere in my in my with my parents. Look what the other kids are doing. They did not care. They didn't care what the other adults were doing either. So we just had a very unique, very different childhood than even some of my other homeschooled friends. It just felt very, very different. Now, part of what was different than what some homeschoolers experienced in the 80s was my parents' primary reason for homeschooling was not to separate us from the culture. It was that my mom wanted to spend more time with us. And she just thought, they're going to be at school all day. That's so long to be separated from them. I want to be more of a part of their life. I want to see them building things. And so the culture in my family was not one of fear or sort of, circle the wagons and keep everyone away. It was, we want to build and experiment and grow, and what could we make out in the woods, and what could we learn from books. And my mom read to us out loud through high school. It was very much this cultivation of learning, cultivation of growing as a person. And I say that, my parents were not perfect people. My mom could be very judgmental of people too. So I come by it naturally. And part of that I think is that kind of crusader part of her that was like, she tried to get a recycling program started at the seminary where my dad was in school to get his master's degrees. Because in her mind, she just thought if we are Christians here on this earth and called to care for this earth, then this is part of caring for it, is not trashing the earth. So that to her was just kind of an extension of her Christian worldview. So I grew up in that kind of home of very much parents who were very passionate about the things they believed, but not parents who did a lot outside of the home on that. My mom really, she said, she used to be much more involved in things like that, she wrote articles and would send them into magazines and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then she said she had 4 children in 5 years, and that pretty much wiped her out, for the next 20 years as she was raising these children. But I saw that. I saw the passion. And I think that's what we got growing up is this focus on following where you believe God is leading you, even if it is not traditional, even if it's not what other people are doing. And that was uncomfortable in a lot of ways for me growing up. Every kid just kind of wants to fit in. Mm-hmm. But I think what I took from that is living out the reality that it just doesn't kill you to do something outside of the norm. And I saw people respect my parents for that. So I didn't experience that as everyone's going to think we're crazy. I thought maybe some kids think we're crazy, but my friends actually loved my parents too. They were very warm people. They loved, having other kids over and things. So I experienced it as it's a good thing to learn about things, to care about things, to work towards things, and not just to fall in line with whatever is, culturally acceptable.
So it's fair to say that you are a lot like your parents.
I think probably so. I hope so. I have deep respect for them. And in the book, I share the story. Both of them have since passed away, but I hope so. I would love to be like them. They were not perfect people, but they were pretty amazing people.
So help me out with something here. I think kids tend to be a little closer to one parent than the other, or a little more influenced by one parent or the other. That doesn't mean that they don't have a great relationship with the other necessarily. It's not a commentary, and it's just somebody that they kind of gravitate towards. And in my household, I had a very good relationship with my dad. My kids, I have 3 kids. 2 of them I think are a little bit closer to my wife than me, and one's closer to me. That's pretty obvious to me. And it's not, like I said, like everybody gets along. There's not an issue here. It's just kind of what it is. You talk a lot about your mom in this book. And even as you started to unpack your answers right now, you started talking about your mom. That's a really interesting thing. I'm interested in whether or not you agree with that assessment, that there's kind of a special bond there between you and your mom, and what role your dad played in all of this.
I think you're right. Part of that, I think, was probably the amount of time that I spent with her. Part of that was that she loved conversation. She loved a good dialogue. One of the things I think was very different about our childhood from a lot of other kids, especially in the South. My parents were not into yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. We never grew up having to say that. Part of that was cultural. They weren't from Mississippi. My parents were both from Iowa, and that wasn't done there. But part of it was we were allowed to push back on things that my parents said in ways that my friends would have gotten in trouble for. And my parents did not take that as disrespect. They took it as conversation, as kind of iron sharpening iron, as us developing the skills that we would need to negotiate in life and manage relationships and figure out and problem solve. We were not expected to just fall into line as soon as they said, go do this. They really allowed a lot of push and pull that other parents I don't think would. So I think through that, I had a lot of conversations with my mom. Some things I disagreed with. I grew up in a very conservative Christian culture, so I had lots of angry conversations around exactly which swimsuit I could wear and exactly how short the shorts could be. And and I thought my parents were just bonkers. I'm not wanting to go out there with nothing on. Just let me live a little. And so, I think some of those things were definitely there, but my mom's influence on me as just somebody who was always there for a conversation, always there to work through things, but she would not do the things for me. When I wanted to get a cell phone, so I guess I would have been 15 then. This is, early cell phone days. And I wanted a cell phone. And she said, well, I said, I'm going to be driving. I need a cell phone. And so I want a cell phone. And how much are they going to pay? And they were very much into that we paid for the things that we wanted that were not like life necessities, which basically meant I was buying all my own clothes by the time I was about 13, because I always had more clothes than were life necessities. And so I just kept filling up my closet with things because I was working then. I babysat, we cleaned our church. I was working by the time I was 6 at our family's janitorial job at our church. And so I always had my own money. So the cell phone thing, she said, okay, well, we will pay for whatever the cheapest option is that's out there. And then if you want extra features or more minutes or whatever, then you pay for that yourself. Well, how am I going to know? How's she going to know what the cheapest option is? Well, she said, you've got to call all the cell phone companies and, write out a list of everything and bring it back to me. And then we'll know what we're going to pay. And then you can decide what you want to do. Oh, Mom, that's so awful. I can't believe this. Nobody else makes their kids do this. This is so crazy. And she would just say, well, that's what we're going to do. I'm preparing you to go out into the world and to be able to make it on your own and solve your own problems and figure out your own things. And this is part of that. And so
someone else made their own kids do that, just so you know.
It's good to know I wasn't alone in the torture.
No.
Things like that, I just think there was a frustration at times with that because I just wanted things to be done for me like we all do. And yet this respect that what she was communicating to me in that, whether I could name it or not, is that she respected me. She trusted me. She thought I could do it. She thought I was capable. And I grew up always believing that my parents believed that I was capable of lots of things. I did not feel like I didn't have a voice or that I couldn't do stuff. I always felt like, well, I could do that. I could do that. I could call them. I could go there. I could do that job. And I think, that's part of what strengthened that relationships, all those conversations, and just that consistently being there, consistently helping me work through, problems at work. She would not deal with those problems for me. I had to go fix those problems myself. I wrote a letter to one of my bosses when I was 15 about a problem I had experienced at work with another employee. What parent wouldn't have wanted to jump in there and say, let me go tell this boss what he needs to do with this other, with this guy. And they didn't do that. They let me work that out myself. They walked with me along the way, but I worked it out myself. And I think that trust that built over time and all of those shared experiences that we were able to have really really built a beautiful relationship that we had. And my dad was always there, but after my mom passed away first when I was 19. And one of the things that she told me before she passed away is she said, keep talking to your dad. He's not going to be the one to start the conversations. He was not one that had lots of words, that had, lots of things he needed to say. She said, keep talking to him. He wants to hear. He wants to know and to be part of your life. But you're probably going to need to be the one that keeps, starting those conversations. He was very happy to be a doer and a quiet servant. That was very much his heart. Was he served as a deacon in our church my whole childhood, worked at a Christian school, was always doing things behind the scenes that people didn't see and not calling attention to it, and just was happy to be doing what he felt like was serving the Lord and serving other people, and very much had a eternal perspective of that he wasn't looking for the crown here. He was investing in the eternal one.
So I understand and feel parts of your story myself. I come from an evangelical background. My dad was the guy he was kind of an outspoken guy. Like if something was wrong, my dad would announce it. Like, this is not the right thing to do, or this is not the right way to go. And he carried himself a certain way as he did all that. So he got put in charge of a lot of things along the way. And I got a chance to watch that happen and realize it wasn't a bad thing to be that guy. Not everybody liked it, but I could tell that there were clearly people that respected it. And this is probably the biggest thing in my own upbringing that matches yours, is that there really was an iron sharpens iron component. I mean, when I was little, I knew that like my dad was the law, but somewhere along the way, that changed radically. And I was allowed respectfully to contend with them. And that still serves me to this very day, frankly, in ways that like I recognize other people don't seem to have exactly the same capacity. And I know exactly where I got it. And then being that my voice mattered. I mean, my dad would be thrilled if he was here to see that I have a podcast. That would just tickle him pink, right? So, and at one point I had a radio show, and he didn't get to see that either. But I mean, if he would have just, all of that would have just like blown him away. He just would have been so happy that happened. So I get it. I can kind of relate to some of what you're saying here, and you talk a lot, and I would encourage people to check out your book. You talk a lot about in detail, although we did get some new information here about what your upbringing was like. But an important part of all of this is that there are some experiences that you have. You deal with trauma in the book. And you also in fact, I think if there's two main themes, it's trauma and its impact, and having a different view of the world, being able to digest information that doesn't necessarily fit in your view of the world. Let's do that one first. How important is it for someone to find out or be open to discovering that the world doesn't fit the clear-cut picture they think they have of it?
Well, I would say now it's incredibly important, but it took me till my mid-30s before I realized that the goal wasn't to figure everything out, put everything in the box, put bows on top of all the boxes, and then say, see, look, I've figured it all out. And I have, I have nothing really more to learn because I understand the world. I understand people, and I understand, A plus B plus C equals D.
But you had some people starting to model this along the way. And the story that I found moving in this regard was Mrs. Horton.
Yeah. So I tell the story in the book, but Mrs. Horton was a woman who went to church with me. I was at a small Presbyterian church all of my childhood. And she worked at a prison and would go and do Bible studies there. I had no context for prison ministry or anything like that. I could not fathom how somebody would want to do that. In my mind, prison was radically violent people who, she's risking her life to even go lead a Bible study with. I didn't have any context for what prison is actually like and who is actually there, which includes some violent people, but a whole lot of other people who are there for other things. And so she would have us kids from the church help her with different projects related to her prison ministry. One of those projects, which I just hated, but my mom, again, was trying to prepare me for life and said, sometimes you got to do things and sometimes you can serve in ways that don't make you feel the best and aren't super fun. And so we would help her to take used Christmas cards and turn them into, reusable Christmas cards by putting little pieces of, pretty cut out paper over top of the little inscriptions in them that people had written. And then she would take them to the prison, and the women that she worked with would send those to their families at Christmas time. So I simultaneously grew up in this culture that was very committed to this kind of tough on crime, tough on drugs, do the time, do the crime, do the time thinking. And then I would have these kind of pinpoints. Mrs. Horton is one of those kind of pinpoints where it sort of shook that, it's like the glitch in the Matrix kind of thing where you go, something doesn't fit about this. She would talk about these women with great affection and love, would talk to us about them, even just us as kids, which there's a side point in there about how important it is to not underestimate what children are picking up when you are just communicating and talking about life. Because I picked up from her that she loved them and that they loved their children, that was beyond mind-boggling for me. I had never even considered that people in prison had children. Like in my mind, they weren't real people, really. They were like kind of, this caricature, which wasn't connected to a family in any way.
So you've got this ability, and you're going to talk about it throughout the book, and we are probably going to continue to touch on it as we're having this interview, to begin thinking outside of your picture, to ask questions, to see things that are quite right. But the other theme in there is trauma. And I know the joining of these two things is that you seem to be analyzing, like, why don't things work? Why did this happen? What is the meaning of stuff? And, you've already related to the audience that both of your parents were gone, and you explain in the book that this happened by the time you were 24. They were both off the scene. I relate to that too, by the way. My mom passed when I was 10, my dad when I was 33. So I get where you're coming from there too. And there's a whole bunch of things that, you don't have there. And there's trauma that's associated with those types of events. But the one that jumped out at me, and this is, I have to say, like, this hit me so hard when it happened in the book that I was like, how is this not in her talk? Like, and that's the train accident. Share with our audience, you were in what was at the time the second worst?
Yeah.
Train accident in U.S. history at the time. Could you explain a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So I was homeschooled, like I said, but my dad worked at a Christian school. So they had a trip that their 8th graders could go on. And then if you were alumni, you could go on that also. So one year they had an extra seat on that trip because somebody dropped out at the last minute. So they had already paid for tickets and everything. And it was a ski trip to go. We would take the Amtrak train up to Canada, ski for 3 days, and then take the train back down to Jackson. This has been a school tradition for many years. And so they asked, I was the right age for that. And so they said, hey, does Christina want to go on this trip? I knew one of the girls who was going. And so I ended up going. I had a great time. And the next year they said, well, since you came last year, we'll let you go again this year. So I went again, but this time on our way back, the Amtrak train always came through Chicago. And about an hour after we left Chicago in the evening, on March 15th, this is 1999, our train hit a tractor trailer that was hauling steel rods from a manufacturing plant that was right next to the train tracks. And the driver of the flatbed truck tried to go around the crossing guards. It's still unclear what happened there, why he would try to do that, but tried to make it past before the train got there, but the train was going too fast and couldn't stop fast enough. And so we ran into that flatbed of steel rods. So if you have a train that that runs into a car, the car usually moves and the train does not. But when you hit something with as much weight and volume as that tractor trailer had, the train just accordioned off the track. And I was in one of the cars that was closer to the front of the train. And so our car jumped the tracks. I was standing in the middle of the aisle waiting to go with some friends to go play cards in the club car. And the train makes impact, which throws all of us off of our feet, starts skidding down the track, and then begins to tip over. So I can feel this as I'm getting thrown onto my back, and I can see out the window that's kind of up opposite me now. I can see that I don't see city lights anymore, which I knew we were passing through a city because I had seen that as I was standing waiting to go play cards. So I knew that we were tipping. And that experience of just uncertainty over what's going to happen. Like it isn't just the first impact. It's the whole, multiple seconds until everything actually stops, of wondering what's going to happen. Are we over water now? Are we about to tip into some kind of body of water? I had heard that happen. I knew that happened on another Amtrak train years earlier. Are we going to hit into another car? Is another car going to hit into us? And that playing out in my mind for the seconds before our car actually stopped. And it was our car that ended up smashing into another car. So 11 people were killed in the accident, most of them in the car that our car ended up slamming into. And we were able to get out. We climbed up the seat. So our car's on its side at this point. We climbed up the seats that are now making up the side of the car, and climbed out one of the windows, which was now on our ceiling, and climbed down the wheels of the car. And then the workers from that steel plant had heard the wreck happening. And so they ran out. This was at night in March. So there was still snow on the ground. They ran out with, hard hats and work boots and all of their what they already had with them because of the type of work that they did, and came and helped to rescue people who were trying to get out of the train even before first responders. They were the ones who were there first. And I'm so grateful to the Lord that he spared my life in that wreck, that he spared the lives of everyone that was in our group. I had a friend whose back was broken. She was in a back brace for many months after that. And was right next to me in our car. And so that experience as a 15-year-old was just, you can't really explain the kind of impact that has. And even the residual impact of reflecting on what happened there and how that impacted me over the course
that's my
of
next
life.
question about that. Like, do you still have nightmares about that? Is that something that, has it had some kind of any kind of lingering effect that lasted in the years that followed?
Yeah. So I don't have nightmares, and I didn't even at the time either. And I remember asking a therapist about that because the school group that we were with, they actually had a therapist come in after we got back and did group therapy with us for a couple of times to just help us kind of try to process that as teenagers. And I remember asking the therapist, I said, I feel like I'm kind of doing okay. Like, am I going to always be doing okay?
Yeah.
Or is it going to the bottom's going to drop out all of a sudden? And they said, well, we don't know because, trauma is it's a complex thing. And so you might be able to just continue on, and it doesn't really have a lasting traumatic impact on you, as in you don't have PTSD from it. But it might just impact you in other ways. And I think for me that is what has happened. I still do have an uncontrollable physical reaction to immediate, to anything that feels like sudden impact. So that if you're flying and you hit turbulence, that feeling of an immediate change,
it's happening
your
again.
bodies is something that is very nerve-wracking for me. And it's there's lots of other things now in my life that are part of that too. I don't tell this story in the book, but when I was pregnant with my first son, our house was hit by a tornado while my husband and I were home. And we ended up having to move out of the house for 4, 5, 6 months while it was getting repaired. We were in a bathtub that was right underneath a tree that fell on our house. It was incredibly traumatic and happened very, very quickly. From the time that the wind started picking up to the time that the tornado sirens went off was probably 5 seconds. From the time the tornado sirens went off to the time that it actually hit our house was probably 10 seconds. So I still, it's such an example of how our bodies hold trauma. It's not just our memories. Our body memory is such a big piece of this. If the wind picks up quickly now, my heart rate will go through the roof before I even know what's happening. I can't control it. It's been 15 years since that happened. It'll wake me up in the middle of the night. If I hear a gust of wind in the trees that went from quiet outside to suddenly it just feels like a big gust of wind, I immediately wake up in full panic mode, scrambling to get my husband to get his phone to figure out if there's a storm coming. I can't, the reflex has never decreased from that experience. So it's interesting how even our traumatic experiences impact us differently over time. With the train wreck, I've become better able to integrate that experience, and I have less of a physical reaction, even when those, bumps in a airline or something like that happen, or if you hit a big pothole, it's a similar kind of experience, sudden shaking. And yet with this weather situation, I'm 15 years in, and I have the exact same physical reaction that I have had since day one, since living through that tornado. And I think that's the big takeaway for me is we realize in our own lives how things impact us that happened to us a long time ago, but we often lack the grace to wonder what someone else has been through that might be impacting why they think the way they do, why they do the things they do. We are all deeply, deeply shaped and impacted by the experiences that we've been through in ways that we often can't choose, and ways we might have been working for years to overcome. And yet we are still impacted. We still live with the scars and how they show up in our lives.
Yeah. And I told you that, I told everyone here at the top of the podcast that we're being sponsored by the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity. And one of the things that the thing that matters the most to that is that an organization is human flourishing. And one of the things that they start off recognizing right away is the subjective nature of happiness, of our values, of our aesthetic preferences, of our experiences, and how that shapes us. Like what makes us tick, what drives us, what things we want to do. That everybody's going to have a different set of experiences and things that they're trying to explore for themselves to figure out how to get there. But you in this book managed to tie your personal experiences, whether it's your parents, whether it's these events, into the subject of trauma, which could just come out of the blue. It could be something that you didn't pick. And if you think about children in particular, most of the traumas that they experience, they didn't have any responsibility for. They didn't select those things. And you introduce a phrase. There's 2 things, I think, by the way, for anybody that I would recommend to buy this book. So let's say you just happen to be somebody who kind of agrees with me on this issue, and you're looking for a good book that is stands up to the drug prohibition arguments. You do 2 things particularly well in that genre, just in that genre. So this isn't just a book about faith or about your journey, but I think there's 2 arguments you make that you do a really good job, and this is one of them. In fact, and before I knew that, I somehow or other sensed that this concept existed, but I hadn't actually heard a specific term put to it before. You talked about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short, adverse childhood experiences, and kind of their impact on human beings. And I'm interested if you could help our audience, if you could unpack that, because I think it's a very, very important thing to understand about why young people in particular seem to be attracted or have issues sometimes with these chemicals.
Yeah, So ACEs is part of what I learned in my learning journey after becoming a foster parent and realizing I had really misunderstood the root causes of addiction and what's actually going on, and that this is not bad people who just want to do bad things. This is suffering people who are trying to feel better, even if it's in a destructive way. But the goal of that is not to destroy their life. It's actually to try to cope with their life. And so I started learning. And one of the things I learned about was adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. They have been studied extensively over the last couple of decades since they were discovered and given a term. And that came through a study that was actually trying to figure out some of the root causes of obesity. And what they realized through that study with many thousands of people that were part of that is that the amount of trauma a person experienced in their childhood, whether that is physical or emotional neglect, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect. So it could be on the active side of abuse, or it could just be on things you didn't get, things that were left out of your childhood, things that were would go into that category of neglect. What they found is that the more of those that people had experienced, the higher their likelihood was of having a problematic relationship with food. And then they started wondering, I wonder if this also tracks into other kinds of behaviors that can be really harmful to your health. And they found that it is causal to so many different things. The amount of trauma you experience in your childhood puts you at a greater risk of developing cancer, heart disease, all kinds of things that we don't think of as connected at all to our experiences. We think of them as maybe genetic, or maybe something that, your poor life choices or health choices might make you more likely to get, but we don't think of it as a result of something that happened to you when you were a child. And yet that has been shown to be true. And also, you are more likely to experiment with drugs if you have been through difficult childhood experiences. You're more likely to develop an addiction. You're more likely to die early. There's so many of these challenges that come, especially related to drug use, that are much more prevalent in adults who have had difficult childhoods. That does not mean that everyone who has been through trauma as a child is going to become addicted. It also doesn't mean that everyone who's addicted has had a traumatic childhood.
Right.
It's just to say that the risk factors there, we know that the more adversity you face in your childhood, and this is not adversity of making your child call the cell phone companies. That's a positive kind of overcoming of a challenge. This is, children who witness domestic violence in their home, children who have been sexually abused, children who have not, had enough to eat, or have lived in violent environments, whether that's in their own home or their community, children who've been in foster care, all of these different kinds of traumatic experiences that a child can be exposed to.
Christina, would fatherless families be a part of that?
Being separated from a parent through incarceration is one of the things that was studied in one of those. Separated from a parent through foster care is another one of those. Losing a parent or losing an immediate family member is another one. So yes, very much so. That having parents go through a divorce is one of them. So there are some of these that we don't think of as affecting us, and yet we do have to acknowledge also that some of the experiences that many children have also fall into that category. And again, which is not to say that they're destined for a particular future, but it does help us if we recognize these experiences are leaving children with scars, that if they don't learn good coping mechanisms to deal with the pain in their life, they are at far greater risk for picking up harmful coping mechanisms that end up really damaging their life even further.
Now, I'm not surprised by any of this, which is why we spend so much time here talking about grace. And I'm wondering if you feel as if people from a more conservative evangelical background have a little bit harder time accepting, like, is there kind of a mentality that you just should pray harder, go to church harder, do your faith harder. Something's wrong with you if you're in these modes. Is that really theologically sound? Like I'm curious about, as you're going through this, because throughout the book you kind of measure yourself against, okay, this is where my faith's at, and here's where I'm at, and am I really seeing the picture clearly? So adverse childhood experiences, the understanding of this, the opening of this, we could spend literally hours just talking about all the different ways and permutations this carries out in our society. Like I can't help thinking that a lot of the reactions we're seeing in a lot of situations, I've discussed this with Bill before, even before I had this particular term, have a lot to do with the fact that the people are going through stuff that we just don't recognize or understand. And they're carrying, just junk, garbage into the world. They're making the world a less tolerable place because this is an expression, this is an outgrowth of the pain that they're experiencing, and maybe their lack of coping mechanisms. Their methods of choosing to cope could even start to harm the people around them. Like, I think we've got an awful lot of that going on in the world, so that this is not, at any level, not just drugs, this is not a minor issue in terms of, you brought up, as you were talking, people having an eating disorder or whatnot. So, I don't know, I said a lot there, but I'm looking to see if you can pack it into kind of like your spiritual, theological approach to the world.
So I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for broader evangelicalism, but for myself, what I picked up was a deep belief that people are responsible for the choices that they make. And that responsibility is something that often allows me to sort of wash my hands of any sense of my own responsibility or my own calling to be part of that. It was kind of, make good choices, good things happen for you. Make poor choices, you're going to have to live with the consequences. So when I saw someone whose life was visibly broken, I did not think, as I do now, I wonder what they've been through. I wonder what has happened to them. What would have to happen to a person for them to get to a point where they are living on the street with nothing but a backpack? What is the backstory to that? Because that doesn't just happen. You don't just wake up one day and that's where you are. That's a series of, certainly choices are part of that, but we make choices in context. We make choices out of experiences that we've had. And so I had a lot of judgment for anyone whose suffering I perceived as being their own fault. They made a choice. So to me, anything related to substance use was your own fault. You were making a choice to use substances. So if you're addicted to them, that's your own fault. So whatever is happening to you is not my problem. And I just lacked the ability to look behind that. And I think, as I've done a lot of interviews on this and talked with other conservative evangelical audiences, one of the fears seems to be, well, if you don't hold people to that kind of high accountability bar of your choices are your fault, then we get into this area where, we're just going to say, do whatever you want because you probably had pain in your life. And so we can't really stop you. And I would say, no, I think in so many areas of our life, we are willing to concede that there's, gray area. There is, when you look at something that's illegal, like alcohol, we say, gosh, alcohol can be really harmful. There are families living under incredible destruction from alcohol misuse, from alcohol addiction. But we acknowledge that the thing that's going to fix that isn't just to go arrest the person and put them in jail for a while. Like we own the fact that we simultaneously can have a problem with alcohol, and we're not just going to go arrest the person and say, well, you made the choice to drink that alcohol that was too much. But when it begins to come into the public sphere, when you are drinking and driving, when you are drunk in public, now you are breaking other laws that are impacting other people, the broader community.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really important point that I hope that people take away is we can't swing the pendulum one way or the other. We don't want to move from lock everyone up. They made their choices. Let's just, hold them to the high standard. And if they didn't make the right choices, they just get whatever they get. We don't want to swing it to the other side where we say, hey, let's just let people do whatever they want because everyone's just trying to make their way in the world. And it doesn't matter who they're harming. Let's just let them, go do their thing. We want to create a world where people can express themselves, can live the lives that they want to be fully present for, can build lives that they want to be fully present for, and that we can also protect the broader community from the impact of those choices, where we allow people to make choices for themselves and build a life they want. And we protect the broader community from the negative impact that that might have, similarly to laws against drinking and driving when we allow you to drink. But I was not able to put a lot of that together in my mind. And, my husband is reading through my journals right now, and he will read me these just hilarious things that I wrote when I was, 8, 9, or 10. Right now I'm 16 in the ones that he's reading. And he said, he'll sometimes send me screenshots, but he'll say, it is so often in your journal that you just berate someone for their choices, for not meeting this high bar of expectation, just this judgmental calling out of the person or people that I thought were really missing the mark. And I will go, the next sentence will be, Lord, help me to grow into the kind of person, who's like Jesus. And he said, it's amazing how kind of blind you can be to the fact that, in one place, you're just on this high horse of what a great person you are and how they are not measuring up. And in the next sentence, I'm in the, I just want to follow you, Lord, and help me to. So I couldn't see. I think it is so hard to see our own blind spots.
Is it a spiritual growth factor? I mean, is there something that comes with spiritual maturity that starts to recognize that, there, but for the grace of God, go I, that my situation, I'm a human being too, and I have my own issues, and now I start to understand. Or do we have to go through bad experiences ourselves to be able to appreciate, what is it that kind of brings you to this position today?
Oh, I hope that it's the spiritual growth. I hope that it is I absolutely has been a humbling experience. That would be the one word that I would use to describe the experience of changing my mind about this kind of tough approach to an approach that recognizes that people make different choices. And just because I don't agree with their choices doesn't mean that I can just send them off to jail and wipe my hands of responsibility for the damage that does to people's lives and families. I like to say, yes, that responsibility is a two-sided coin. People are responsible for the choices that they make, and the community is also responsible for how we respond to those choices. So a person might choose to use a drug. That does not absolve me from the responsibility of supporting them being arrested and having their future employment opportunities destroyed. I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for the kinds of responses that I am supporting. So I think it is for me, it has been a humbling experience, one that I am still in the middle of. I still find biases in my own heart all the time. I still find judgment in my own heart all the time. But I think that was a big part of what I learned along the way, was the coming face to face with my own judgment and really seeing that I had radically misunderstood what people are struggling with. And that has made me much less likely to be certain that I understand, X, Y, or Z. Anytime I hear people make these definitive statements of, well, it should be this way. It should be that way. They should do this. They should do that. They shouldn't do this or that. I have a reflexive, I used to be reflexively in favor of anything that felt very black and white. I loved, let's just make it easy. I am now reflexively opposed to things that feel very black and white, because what happens is we take our own culture, our own experiences, our own preferences, and we try to put those onto everybody else. And that ends up causing a lot of harm to people, because we don't know their life. We don't know what they've been through. We don't know what they're trying to build, what their dreams and hopes are. And that clashes often when I try to overlay my plan for your life, Jim, with your plan for your life. It doesn't tend to go well when somebody who doesn't even know you says, I think I know what's best for you.
Exactly.
I can try to influence you. I can try to teach you. I can try to paint a picture that I hope that you want to live into. But when I try to force you to live the life that I want you to live, and I threaten or do put you in jail because you don't live the life that I want you to live, I think we do incredible harm. And I do not think that is the heart of God for people or for his children to be part of. I am a deep believer that Christians are called to a high calling. God does give us some very black and white commands, but that is something I have chosen to live into because I have become a Christian and I am claiming to follow Jesus and I am wanting to live into that. It is not my calling or responsibility to try to force those values and force that life onto other people. I think it is a great disservice to what
and it doesn't work at the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity. This is what they spend their full time pointing out, that every time that coercion of any kind is used, that happiness, harmony, and prosperity decline. They don't go up, they go down. This is not the way to make the world a better place. It's a shortcut. We think that we're going to be able to get somewhere without, trying to persuade people of a position, without trying to understand where they're coming from. We think somehow or other we can get there quicker if we just make a law, if we just make a rule, if we just force people to be like us, or we put them into some kind of crucible socially. And it just doesn't work. And what it does instead is it tends to isolate. And there's one other piece of science that backs up this adverse childhood experiences theory, and that is Rat Park. And I thought you did a great job of explaining Rat Park in the book, but how would you explain it here to our audience?
Yeah, so Rat Park was one of the experiments that I read about on my learning journey after meeting the mother of my foster son, who really helped me realize that I had radically misunderstood something about addiction, because she was a mom like me. And she was also struggling with a meth addiction. And I didn't have a category for that. I tell that story in detail in the book. But I wanted to learn. I wanted to know what I was missing, because we were foster parents because we wanted to be a voice and an advocate for people who were struggling, for children who were in vulnerable situations. And the more that I got to know his mom, the more I thought, maybe one of the best things that I can do is understand how we could better approach addiction, because most of the children in foster care are there for some addiction-related cause in their family. And so I started learning.
Wait. Say that again. Most of the children in foster care are there because
some sort of drug-related removal.
Okay. We've talked about trauma and its impact on the broader world, but if we had a better way of dealing with addiction, we could dramatically reduce the number of children who are in foster care.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, I wasn't going to go there, but that strikes me as huge, because how many children are carrying around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, because they were in foster care? And not just because of the separation from their parents, but because sometimes bad things happen to kids in foster care, right? And then the cycle's perpetuated, and we end up with those same people in trouble with the criminal justice system, in trouble with addiction issues, having trouble maintaining personal relationships with significant others or even their own children, and it just kind of keeps perpetuating. So what you just said is like high leverage for potentially reducing the number of children that are in foster care.
Yep. And that's why I ended up not diving deeper into foster care, but starting in it for good, because I felt like it's a way to go upstream and to say, if we could fix some of these other issues, then we could dramatically reduce the number of children in foster care, the number of children that are being exposed to ACEs. When you think about, one of the ACEs also, this is a little rabbit trail for a moment, one of them is living in an unsafe community. So you think about the kind of crime and violence that drug prohibition perpetuates all around the world in communities, typically in lower income communities, feel the most weight of that crime and violence. And so you've got children that are growing up. Maybe their parent already has an addiction. So that is an ACE in and of itself if you're living in a home with a person in active addiction. But then if you've got drug prohibition, now you've introduced the incarceration of their parent. That's another ACE. Living in an unsafe neighborhood, if they live in a neighborhood where the crime and violence concentrates, that's another one. You might have them being removed to foster care either because of their parent being unable to parent them, or if their parent just gets arrested, even if they were parenting them just fine, that would be another ACE. So we are setting children up for their own risk factors to be, it's like they're out of the gate. They immediately have multiple ACEs, which increases their odds of developing an addiction by, hundreds of percents from people that don't have those. So yes, this is absolutely a way to go upstream, and is one of the reasons why I just think it is so important to be able to decrease the amount of trauma that children are experiencing. I see ending drug prohibition as a massive program in trauma reduction. That would be like biggest picture. What I think it could do would be to dramatically reduce the amount of trauma that children are experiencing. And even if we had more people using drugs, or even if we had more people who became addicted to drugs, the ability for us to correctly respond to those things, to adequately educate people about the real risk factors, instead of just saying, be afraid, be very afraid of these drugs. And then most people just are not that afraid. They go on using them anyway. So if we could adequately educate, if we could begin developing social norms and social influence to help people make healthier choices. And then if they did develop an addiction, that they would be able to get help very quickly before that addiction spirals. And they would not be using these contaminated drugs that they bought on the street, which is exposing them to a whole different lifestyle that many people get drawn into also. They're far more likely to die. They're far more likely to be paying a lot more than a market value would be for a particular substance, because underground prices are higher. That means they're far more likely to engage in criminal activity to get enough money to fund that addiction. And now we've got property crime, and we've got all of that trauma that happens. It just is this. I see drug prohibition is this trauma creation program, and ending it and shifting to these health-centered approaches to substance use, like we have with other kinds of substance use, could dramatically decrease the amount of trauma that not just people using drugs experience, but for children all over the world. Absolutely.